Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Refactoring Explored. In this episode, we're going to talk about some of the most critical terminology that we're going to be using throughout the course. So let's get started. The first thing is, why are we building this kind of terminology, and why is it so important? See, programming is a social activity. If you could communicate, you're going to do wonders. If you cannot communicate, you're a dead mate. You just don't exist on the team. Any field, like any other field, programming has its own jargon. And if you could communicate, or if you're willing to communicate with other people on your team, you're basically going to need to master this kind of jargon, the terminology that we're going to be using. It's like design patterns, it's like the various refactoring techniques, the various code smells, everything has a name in and of itself. If you know how to communicate with those, you will know how to communicate better with your team, to communicate ideas, to communicate thoughts, to communicate solutions, and so on and so forth. And by the way, if you want to make any kind of breakthroughs on a financial level and a professional level, you're going to have to understand this terminology. You're going to need to master it and know it by heart. And that is how important it is. So the terms that we're going to talk about today are very simple, and they're actually not so many. It's just those six. The first one is client. Now, what it means, what does that mean? What does it mean to say that this piece of code is a client of another code? Now, it's basically a piece of code that consumes a specific class, module, or package. It's something like that. It's basically pretty much like the main function or the main subroutine in a Java or a C program. Basically what it is that it starts to create all the dependencies or instantiate all the major classes, and starts asking those classes to do it some favors. It starts asking them to fire some functions. It starts asking them to perform some kinds of actions. And this is basically what it means that the piece of code is asking another piece of code to do stuff. That piece of code, the first one, is called, the formal one, is called a client. Now, the other one that is being asked for all these favors and receiving all these requests is called a server, which is a piece of code that's being called or being consumed by another piece of code. And that, in this context, the other piece of code would be the client, of course. So it's a very simple client-server architecture. However, it's not a communication across networks. Basically, any piece of code asking or sending messages to another server, to another piece of code, is called a client, and that other piece of code which is receiving all those messages or all these requests is called a server. Now, what is the API? The API, actually the three letters API, they stand for Application Programming Interface. Now, what is that? Basically, it's the public part of a server. So a client is capable of consuming that public part because, for example, imagine the fact that you have the situation where you have a class, and this class is made of multiple functions, and it has those behaviors that are public, but at the same time it has some utility functions and it has some helper methods that both are going to be private. They're kept inside of it for internal use only, right? Now, the public part of the interface, the public part of the class itself, that's going to be consumable by external components, whether you're dealing with a utility class, whether you're dealing with a business domain model, whether you're dealing with a business entity. It's just going to be a consumable part of that class, and the consumable part of that class is called an API. Now, what is a code smell? When I talk about a code smell, that's a repetitive negative practice affecting code readability, and it affects its changeability. So why is it a negative practice? Well, it's a bad thing. For example, they're known by their names. Like, for example, I could say, this guy is performing a shotgun surgery. Or I have seen here a switch statement. I have seen here an inheritance bequest, or a legacy, they call it a rejected bequest. Bequest is basically like something which is inherited from a class. It's an object orientation abuser, and we're going to talk about that in a future video. No worries. So basically, it's something that appears in the code, so I could identify it. So it's something which is repetitive, not to be confused with an anti-pattern, okay? It's not an anti-pattern. Some of them are anti-patterns, but It's not an anti-pattern. It's just called a code smell. Refactoring. Now, refactoring, the word refactoring could have two different meanings. It could be a noun or it could be a verb. When I'm talking about a noun, I'm talking about a series of actions or a sequence of actions that I could use to eliminate some code smell in my code. So basically, when I say, hey, you see, I could see a switch statement in your code. Why don't you try to replace that with a state or strategy? Now, replacing a switch statement or a type code with a state or strategy, that's a name of a refactoring. You could take that name and you could look it up. That's so to speak, it's a proper noun. You can take that, it's a proper name. You can take that and you could start looking in the catalog. You could reach out to Google and you could search that. On the other hand, refactoring is a verb, so I would say refactor the code. That is, please clean it up. The practice of making the code look better and feel better and reads better, so it would be easier to change that. So you need to know if I'm going to use a refactor or a refactoring for the betterment of my code, or I'm going to refactor my code. So it could be a noun or a verb. So let me give you an example that combines all these together. Let's say I have a file system class that can manipulate files, directories, permissions, and their ownership, and copy, create new files, new folders, copy them, rename them, move them, and so on, right? Now, if I'm going to consume that file system from my code base, that means that file system is a server, okay? It's a server to all the requests that could come from multiple parts of my code base. The public part of that file system class is the API of that class, right? So when I have a function, for example, there that's called create new directory, okay, that is a new thing. It's creating a new directory. It's going to take the fully qualified name of the directory, that is the full path, the absolute path to where I want my new directory to be created. And it's going to take a name so I can create it. Maybe it's going to take some permissions like 0777. That would be a very bad idea. Don't do that. But, you know, it's just an example. And a file uploader utility could utilize that class, and it's called to consume the API. It is set to consume the API of the file system, right? Of the file system class. Now, therefore, it is a client of the file system. And that's very important. I need you to understand this relationship because it's going to become so critical down the line when we're studying the code smells and the catalog. Basically, building the catalog is really important, and especially next episode when we decide to talk about the cycle, or it's going to probably be the 4th episode, I'm not really sure, but it's basically going to be like that, right? You need to make sure you understand the relation between a server and a client. Now, let's say that there is a bad design decision that I made while I was designing the file system, and that caused a smell to appear, a code smell to appear. That means there is something bad. It's a very bad thing. I used some primitive data with primitive obsession in the way, or I did something that is wrong, right? I did something wrong. And we might need to refactor the code smell, right? We need to refactor it by using the specific refactoring that could help us get rid or eliminate, get rid of that code smell or eliminate that code smell. So this is basically all of our terminology used in one example. And so the conclusion of this episode, what I want to get at is that communication is the mother of all successes, and it's the reason behind most failures. If you are ready to communicate well, if you want to have a promotion, if you want to do anything which is good, you need to know how to communicate, and you need to know how to communicate very well. Thank you very much for watching this episode. I hope you have had some fun. You learned something. I know that this could be so primitive, but I can't take no chances, basically. Thank you very much. If you liked the video, please subscribe to the channel, share the video, and please like the video because there's a lot more of that where that came from is coming at you. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any comments, please leave them down below. If you have anything that you would like to tell me or ask me to add or to make concrete, if something was abstract or too vague, just let me know, and I'm going to try to clarify it in future videos. Thank you very much for your cooperation with me, and have a lovely day. Bye.